Good morning. Good to see so many people out this morning. I want to welcome our visitors. We're glad to have you with us. And those tuning in to our Facebook live stream, we're glad that you've chosen to tune in this morning as well. This morning's lesson is entitled, Do Circumstances Cause Sin? And we're going to be looking in Philippians 4, 11 to 13. I'd invite you to go ahead and turn there. It's going to be the first passage we look at, but we're going to do so in just a few minutes. Do circumstances cause sin? Another way to word this would be, do our circumstances in life cause us to do good or cause us to do bad? That's been a question that philosophers, theologians, society in general has wrestled with. Talking about, does a good environment produce good people and bad environments produce bad people? And it's such a shock in the news when someone makes the news because they've done something evil. And the people that stand back in shock saying he was materially blessed. He had a good home. The idea there is he should have been happy. He should have been doing well, or he or she. And it's an absolute shock. But on the other hand, when someone commits evil and it's like it's no big deal. Well, they came from a broken home. They came from the wrong side of the tracks. That's what happens. But shock is expressed when it happens from someone that just society says that shouldn't have happened. So, do our circumstances in life control us and cause us to sin, or do we choose to do right no matter our circumstances? There have always been speculations on whether a good environment or bad environment makes us who we are. Many experiments have been conducted on the matter. Many studies have been conducted on the matter. Society today blames a lot on the home, the city, or the school that someone attends, the friends someone grows up with, even the color of one's skin, to defend the crimes and sin that people commit, or to explain away their blessings. Well, they had it good. There's no reason they should have gone off the rails and did that. Movies have been made. Stories have been told on role reversals of good and bad people to see if the bad person in a good environment turns good, or the good person in a bad environment turns to crime or turns bad. The picture here, some of you might recognize it, some others may not. There's an old 1980s movie, I believe 1983, called Trading Places. And I want to make a disclaimer before I talk any more about this movie. My family and I watched it on TV back in the days when the television studios would play a prominent movie as it was just released, and they would edit it. I was shocked as an adult to go back and watch this, and it was unwatchable. So I encourage you, if you do watch it, find the TV edit. It's watchable, and it's a great story. The story in this movie, though, however, is two very rich and powerful people who play with the lives of two other people. One, another rich and powerful person of privilege, and one, a homeless person. And they take the homeless person and they say, we're going to give him the life of the rich and powerful guy. And they destroy and discredit the rich and powerful guy to make him the homeless guy. Something's happening with the mics here. So, their whole bet, and they bet each other $1, that the homeless guy, given the good environment, is going to turn good, and the rich and powerful guy whose life they destroyed, when they make him homeless, he's going to turn to a life of crime. CJ's on it. This mic shouldn't have gone out, though. It did. Technical difficulties. Sorry about that. So the question this morning is, are good circumstances the cause of faithfulness? And are bad circumstances the cause of sin? And as I put this lesson together, I envisioned it being interactive. So there's going to come a time, as we look through the body of this lesson, I'm going to ask you a question, and it's going to be very similar to a yes or no question. I want you to blurt out what you think the answer is. And the answer is either going to be sin or faithful. So those are the two options, not yes or no, but sin or faithful. So when I ask you the question, you're going to call it back to me the way you remember it, because this is going to be kind of a refresher course. We're not going to be able to look at all the scriptures and the examples that I have on the slide. This is going to be kind of a refresher course for your memory and your studies. And did this bad circumstance or good circumstance produce good or bad people? But before we do that, let's look at Philippians 4:11-13. Because here's the thing. We don't always get to choose the environment we live in. We don't always get to choose. We certainly don't get to choose the family we're born into. We don't get to choose the environment or the circumstances or sometimes even the school that we get to attend. We don't often have those types of choices. But what choice we do have is to either do right or wrong in either of those circumstances. Paul tells us in Philippians 4:11-13, "Not that I speak from want, for I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means. I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Paul is saying, I know what it's like to live in poverty. I know what it's like to be poor and to live in the street. I also know what it's like to live in prosperity. So he says, I know what it is to have everything filled. He says, I learned the secret of being filled and going hungry. But Paul says he knew what abundance was and he knew what suffering need was. But Paul's character stayed constant, didn't it? It didn't matter if he was in need, if he was hungry. It didn't matter if he had everything met. He says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. He said he gave his life to Christ. He trusted in him. He followed him. And it didn't matter what any of these circumstances caused. Paul says he learned to be content in whatever circumstances he found himself in. What about you and I? Are we able to say what Paul said? That it doesn't matter what circumstance, whatever's going on around us, whatever situation it is, we can still do what's right. We can be content. So, the question we're going to start off by asking is a good environment the cause of faithfulness? Does living under the perfect circumstance create perfect people? We're going to first talk about Eden. What about Eden? Surely in a paradise, man would do what's right. So, Adam and Eve, sin or faithful? Sin. How do we know? Genesis 2:8, Genesis 3:1-19, and Genesis 3:6-7. Oh, how some long to return to the Garden of Eden. Mankind ever since has longed for this utopia. We want to create a utopian society where everything is cared for. There's no want, there's no crime, there's no evil. And no matter how many times man tries to create this utopian society, evil sneaks in. Every single time. Because we're human. And we have our ambitions and our selfishness. Just 2 years ago, or going on 2 years ago, a utopian society that they were called the New Utopian Society crept up in Seattle. Do you guys remember that? People took over a portion of Seattle, called it Chaz. And they said everyone who came in, and they were trying to get the United States to recognize them as sovereign, give them their own government. But what happened? 3 murders over one weekend, and the police stormed it, and that was the end of Chaz. And it lasted for a lot longer than it ever should have. But it lasted for a few months, and people called it a utopian. Oh, they were building gardens. They were going to live off the land. But 3 murders over one weekend brought it all crashing down. Sin crept in. Sin crept in. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 8. In Eden, every necessity was cared for. It was the most beautiful place on earth. Certainly, that would be the best situation. The return to the way God created man. The perfect surroundings where man could keep himself from sinning and remain faithful to God. And we'd add a ... right? Right? No. Genesis 3:1-19, even the Garden of Eden did not guarantee that man would not sin. Eve saw the fruit, that it was delicious to the eyes, and it could make one wise. And she fell to the temptation of the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. And she gave to her husband, who knew better. They both knew better. She had quoted God's commandment back to the serpent, back to the devil. But then she and her husband both took the fruit and they ate it. And so in Genesis 3, 6-7 is recorded the fall of man. They became aware of right and wrong, and they knew that they had done wrong, they had sinned. So everyone who yelled out, "Sin to me," was right. They sinned. A paradise environment does not cause one to become faithful. What about riches? This is also an experiment throughout time. Philosophers and theologians and society in general has always tried. If you have it all, wouldn't you do what's right? You should be happy. What about King Solomon? Sin or faithful? Sin. Solomon had a magnificent environment. 1 Kings 10:23 tells us he had wisdom, power, and wealth beyond any other king before him or after him. He received 666 talents of gold a year in tribute from 1 Kings 10:14. A talent weighs 75 pounds. You do the math. Start figuring up just figure that up in today's wealth, what gold goes for an ounce, and figure up 666 talents worth of gold a year. And all of us would be envious of King Solomon's career choice, right? We'd all want his salary. 1 Kings 11:4, though, tells us Solomon's surroundings and environment did not make him a faithful man. He turned his eyes to the women of the world, and they turned his eyes to the idols of the world. 1 Kings 11:4-10 says, even with all his wisdom and his power, he allowed his heart to be turned away from God, who was the source of all his wisdom, all his power, and all his wealth. The very one who gave him everything. Solomon turned his heart away from him to chase after things made of wood, stone, and precious gems and metals. People with good jobs who enjoy blessings of wealth today often forget the one who gave them that. And they too, like Solomon, often allow Satan to tempt them away from God. James 1:17 says, it is God from whom all blessings flow. All good things are given from God. So everyone who yelled out, "Sin to me," was correct. Solomon, with all his riches, used them and abused them for sin. What about a good home? That's the question, isn't it? A good home. Surely someone from a good home is going to do what's right. That's the shock in society today when headlines are splashed across our internet or on the newspaper front page. Somebody did something terrible, and they're saying, well, this person was from a very good home. They had everything. They had a loving parent. They had two loving parents, whatever it is. Oh, shock of shocks. He had turned to crime. A good home? What about the young son in Luke 15? Sin or faithful? I already heard it. Sin. Yes, Jesus tells a story. He tells it as a parable and becomes known as the parable of the prodigal son. But this prodigal son had a very good home. His father loved him. He had enough wealth that the young son comes to him and asks him for his inheritance early, is granted that inheritance early. The father didn't have to do that, but he gave it to him, entrusted it into his power. He lived under the best of circumstances, according to most people's thinking, even today. Hired servants at his beck and call, rings and robes and anything that he could want under this man's roof and being called this man's son. But in Luke 15, 11-13, that good home did not keep the boy faithful or from sin. In fact, it didn't even keep him at home, did it? He went far away into a foreign country, it says. He became known as the prodigal son. Prodigal means reckless and extravagant. It also means loose living. And that's what the older brother accused him of, isn't it? He went away and squandered his inheritance, it says, with loose living. Many today are shocked when people from good homes go and do bad things. Many times it makes headlines. Christians who grow up in the church and know better often fall away and sometimes never return. Why is that? They had a good home. They had one of the best teachings they could have. They grew up hearing of the love of Christ and all the things that God had blessed them with and the promise still to come of an eternal home with him. And yet so many wander off and do their own thing. I heard you all answer me that he sinned. He sinned, Good homes do not cause one to be faithful. The good news of that story, though, was he didn't stay in sin. He returned, didn't he? He humbled himself, and he came back, and the Father loved him and opened his arms and put a robe and the rings back on his fingers and called him his son. The last category we're going to look at is a good environment, the cause of faithfulness. What about heaven? Did angels sin or did they stay faithful? Sinned. Not all. Just like not all mankind lives in sin, but angels are no different. How do we know? There's two passages that tell us this. 2 Peter 2:4 says angels who sin were cast into hell. And the word there is the only word for hell used in the New Testament. It's the Greek word tartaros. It means the deepest pit of Hades. And according to the Greeks, this pit of Hades was reserved for the wicked of wicked. And in fact, Peter goes on to tell us that into the pits of darkness, reserved for judgment. He says, God did not spare sinful angels. Even those he created to be in his presence, night and day, saying, holy, holy, holy. Even in that environment, there were those who sinned. In Jude 6 tells us angels who are created beings lived in the presence of God Almighty. They have sinned. They left their domain or their abode. That's what it says. They left heaven to do their own thing. And so they were cast out. And Jude 6 says they were placed in chains and are reserved for judgment in the blackest of black. Darkness. Both Peter and Jude speak of that place being reserved for judgment as being in blackness and darkness where there is no light. It's terrible to think of, to be trapped there and then to be cast from that into the hellfire that awaits them. There's nothing good coming from their sinning. They sinned. Even in heaven, there have been angels who sinned and were cast out. So a so-called good environment is not the solution to sin. I want you to turn over with me to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 30. Proverbs 30. We're going to read verses 15 to 16. This describes the hearts of men. It says, the leech has two daughters. Give, give. There are three things that will not be satisfied, four that will not say enough. Sheol and the barren womb, earth that is never satisfied with water, and fire that never says enough. When we seem to have everything in the eyes of man, and yet we want more, we have not learned, like the Apostle Paul, to be content in any circumstance. We're like the leech. When is the leech satisfied? It always wants more and more blood. What about famined earth? How much water does a famined earth want? All of it. What about an all-consuming fire? It says never enough. The barren womb, the woman that wants children so badly and can't have it, when is she ever going to be satisfied? Nothing's going to satisfy that. Nothing's going to fill that. It's going to be this hunger forever and ever, as long as that lasts. So Solomon in all his wisdom writes that if we have everything and yet we want more and more, we're like that leech or that barren womb or the famined earth or the all-consuming fire that never says enough. Even under the best conditions, man and angels have sinned. If one is foolish and rebellious, the best surroundings will still lead to sin. This is what Paul says in 1 Timothy 1, 8-11, describing rebellious and foolish men. Temptation and sin arises when one is not content and covets more and more. James 1, 14-15 says, we lust, we give in to that lust, we sin, and sin brings forth death. He says in James chapter 4, 1-3, he says, you covet and you don't have, so you murder and you fight with one another. When we are not content in our circumstance, and all we want is more and more and more, we're going to sin. Just as we can see in all these individuals, man and angels, who had the best of circumstances, but it wasn't enough. So is a bad environment the cause of sin? Does living in adverse or terrible circumstances produce sinful people? What about slavery? It's one of the most evil, vile, wrongful things we could ever think of to be done to another person. Would someone in slavery, would that person ever become something good? What about Joseph? Sin or faithful? Faithful. Although he was only 17 years old, Joseph faced tremendous burdens and temptations on his young shoulders. Within his own family, he faced strife, jealousy, and hatred from his own brothers. And in Genesis 37, 2 through 5 and 8 through 11, for his dreams, his brothers mocked him and hated him, and even his own father rebuked him. In Genesis 37, 18 to 28, his brothers threw him in a pit and plotted to murder him. But instead of murdering him, they decided to make some money instead. And so they sold him into slavery. And his life took a turn for the worse, didn't it? From there, maybe there is this bright shining moment where he's bought by, from all that we can tell, this good Egyptian man named Potiphar, who saw the good in Joseph, even at this young age, and made him the master of his house, entrusted everything to him. But even in slavery, Joseph's problems did not stop, even in an environment such as that, where he was elevated to the master of the house. In Genesis 9, 11 to 20, he was falsely accused of rape and thrown into prison, where he remained for at least 7 years from what we can tell from the scriptures. Yet under all these circumstances, Joseph did not sin, but remained faithful to God. And in fact, we can see in Genesis 45, 5 to 8, looking back, remember hindsight's 2020? We always see a little clearly on the other side of it. In Genesis 45, 5 to 8, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers who have thought him dead all these years, and he tells them, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. God put me here to save you and to save many lives. Joseph was able to recognize every step from the moment he was thrown into that pit, God was with him and God was in control. What faith! What faith to be able to see that through all those adverse conditions, to be falsely accused one after another and to suffer for it. But then finally elevated to second in command only to Pharaoh and in charge of all the land because God was with him. And to not even let that go to his head, but give the credit and the glory and the honor to God. Joseph was faithful. Even in captivity, Joseph remained faithful to God. Some of the most worst conditions we could ever think of ourselves put in, and Joseph remained faithful to God. What about losing everything? This was the point of the movie I pointed out earlier, Trading Places. What if we take this guy and make him lose everything, put him on the street? Will he turn to a life of crime? Well, we can read of an instance like this in the scriptures. And the experiment being the same thing. Satan tells God, your faithful man Job has a hedge of a protection around him. Let's see what happens when we remove the hedge. Let me at him. So Job, sin or faithful? Faithful. Satan even tried to apply this to Job's faithfulness. Job had it all. Everything a man could want. He had riches, a big family, fame, wisdom, and good health. And yet he lost everything, even his health. In Job 1 and 2. By the end of chapter 2, Job's friends wouldn't even be able to say, well, Job, at least you have your health. No, he lost even that. In Job 1, 8 to 11, Satan told God that Job only worshiped him because of his good environment. And then throughout the book, Satan begins to take from him all that he had materially and then also physically. And in Job 1, verse 22, after losing all that he had materially, it says he did not sin or blame God. That's amazing. There are people today who lose it all. Faithful men and women who lose it all and then blame God and forfeit their souls. Job 2, 9 to 10, after being afflicted physically, now he's lost his health. His own wife comes and tells him, why don't you just curse God and die? She's saying, just get it over with. There's nothing left to live for. We've lost everything, and you've even lost your health. He's covered in sores and boils. But we read there in Job 2, 9-10, that he scolds her and says, shall we not accept the good with the bad? What faith! What faith to be able to look at his surroundings. He's literally sitting in the dust and ashes of what once was a beautiful and good environment. And he says, shall we not accept the good with the bad? And throughout the book, Job maintains his innocence and holds on to his faith to God. And in the end, because of that, he is vindicated. And God restores to him his good environment. And it even tells us that the daughters he was blessed with again, that they were the most beautiful in the land. So not only did God give him everything again, God gave him the best of everything again because of his faith. So he was faithful. In losing all he had, Job did not sin. We talked about what about a good home? Let's talk about what about a bad home? Because so many times people attribute bad homes to bad people. Bad homes produce bad people. But is that always the case? People have a right to choose, don't they? So what about Jonathan? Sin or faithful? Faithful. I'm glad you said that. Let's remind ourselves of the home that he came from. Because so many people blame the home for a crime and say, well, he or she came from a broken home. And they try to use that to garner sympathy for the accused. Sometimes when you hear people say that, it's used as an excuse. Well, you just got to kind of give them that crime. They didn't know any better. No, that's not the case. 1 Samuel 15, 20-21. Jonathan came from a bad home. He came from a spiritually dead home. Saul was king, but he wasn't a good one. Saul looked out after his own interests, not of those of his people. In 1 Samuel 15, 20-21, Saul even blamed the people when he sinned, when he did not annihilate the Amalekites as God had told him to. He blamed it on the people when Samuel came in and confronted him on it. Then in 1 Samuel 20, 30-33, not only did Saul try to kill David, but then when David ran and he confronts his son Jonathan because of his friendship with David, and he tells Jonathan, you're the crown prince. You're going to be king one day, except for David's in the way. Right after that little confrontation, when Jonathan stands up for David, anyone remember what Saul did to Jonathan, or tried to do? He threw a spear at his own son, the crown prince. He just said, you ought to be king. He tries to kill his own son. Parents, have you tried to kill your own son or daughter? Just this past week? No, that's not something we think about doing. Saul was that kind of guy that when he got angry and was displeased with the answer his son gave, he tried to kill him. In 1 Samuel 23, 16-18, Jonathan comes to David, and one of the last times they're going to see each other alive. In 1 Samuel 23, 16-18. And Jonathan says he knew that God removed his father from being king, and he was perfectly content and serving under David, showing he had absolute faith in God. And this isn't the first time he showed faith in God. We didn't even talk about when he takes his armor bearer and goes up and slaughters 20 Philistines all by themselves because of his faith in God. But Jonathan here, when it really mattered, his livelihood as king, as the next king of Israel, depended on David being done away with. And he comes to David and comforts David, who is on the run, and says, you will be king, and I will be your right-hand man. And then gets David to swear that he will treat his family kindly. Jonathan came from a spiritually dead home, and yet his faith in God was strong enough to allow him to see past his own legacy, his own birthright, and to throw his lot in with David, whatever that would be. Because he recognized that David was God's anointed. He came from a spiritually dead home, and yet everyone shouted that he was faithful. A broken home does not cause one to sin. We can still choose, like Jonathan, to do what is right despite what our family is doing around us. What if you were stoned and beaten, and we could add left for dead? The Apostle Paul, sin or faithful? Faithful. faithful. Suppose you were stoned, beaten, and imprisoned. Would that be enough for you to blame God and sin against him? We like to tell ourselves no. We like to use the example of Joseph, like to use the example of Paul, who also was falsely accused and imprisoned. He was beaten and stoned in Lystra. He was stoned and beaten and imprisoned many times, not just once. But in Acts 14:19, Paul was stoned and left for dead in Lystra. Back in verse 8, he comes to Lystra, and here he's stoned and left for dead. 2 Corinthians 11:23 through 33, he says he was beaten times without number by both his countrymen and his enemies, 5 times whipped for 39 lashes, shipwrecked 3 times, countless nights without sleep, dangers around every corner. Yet in all this, Paul did not curse God, nor did he blame God. In fact, 2 Timothy 4:7-8 tells us the end of the story for him, that despite all of that, what he went through, living under all these awful conditions, Paul gives comfort to Timothy, saying, I kept the faith. I finished the course. I fought the fight. Those were words of comfort that he could give Timothy. Even as his own execution was drawing near, he says, my life is already being poured out as a drink offering. My time is at hand. But he's basically saying, don't worry about me. Don't mourn for me. I've kept the faith, and there's a reward waiting for me. Jesus, the rightful or the faithful judge, will award to me that crown of life. Nothing would take that away from Paul. Not stonings, not beatings, not imprisonment, not even going sleepless nights with dangers around every corner, not shipwrecks. Nothing would take his faithfulness away from him. He was the example of Jesus saying, what would you give for all the world? What would it take for you to forfeit your soul? Paul says, nothing. He was absolutely faithful. He did not allow his circumstances to influence him to sin. Bad circumstances do not cause one to sin. The men above were under such adversity that makes us shudder to think about what the conditions must have been like for men such as Paul and Joseph and Job and Jonathan, with your own, afraid to maybe even go into your own home because your father might get angry and throw a spear at you again. In Revelation chapter 2 and verse 13. Turn over to Revelation chapter 2 and verse 13. Here to the church at Pergamum, Jesus instructs to be written down. He says, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one who is killed among you, where Satan dwells. Can you imagine this congregation, what it dealt with? Here in Revelation 2:13, Jesus is talking to the church at Pergamum, and he says that one of them among them was murdered. And he called him his faithful one. And he says, you kept the faith. You did not deny me, even when you saw one of your own number murdered. That's such a commendation to the church at Pergamum. And then he's going to write in verse 14, I've got a few things against you. But losing their faith and denying God was not one of them. They were able to hold fast to him through that. Temptations may be worse in adverse conditions, but temptations are there and just as strong under good circumstances. Think of all the temptation that comes when you have everything and the means to do whatever you want to do. There is great temptation that comes with that. Children of God still need the right attitudes. To be obedient, Romans 6:17-18. To be steadfast, Colossians 1:21-23. And to trust in God, Proverbs 3:5. Even under the worst conditions, we can keep ourselves from sin and remain faithful. The controlling factor in answering these questions, the controlling factor in whether we sin or not, is not our outward circumstances, but our inward state of mind. Society may make excuses for the deeds of man, but there will be no excuses on the day of judgment. We will give an account on that day for our own actions. Look in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10, or read it on the slide. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad. We're going to give an account to God. We're going to stand at the judgment seat of Christ, and we're going to give an account for the things we have done, whether good or bad. And saying, well, I came from a bad environment isn't going to cut it. Saying, well, I came from a good environment isn't going to cut it. It's a matter of the heart and who we trust and who we walk after. The bottom line is we may not always be able to choose the environments we live in, but we do choose how we will live in them. That is something in our power, and that God expects us to live right. So the question is, what about you? In your current trials and storms of life, and we know of some of the trials and storms of life that many of our number are going through. But for the rest of us, it's between our hearts and God. We may not know what one another is going through. So the question is to you directly. In your current storms of life, in your current trials, will you sin or will you stay faithful? That's the question before us this morning. But let us look to those good examples, that no matter what their circumstance was, they would let nothing take their faith from God. And let us use them as our example. If you're not a Christian this morning, you need to become one. No matter what environment you live in, good or bad, you're lost if you're not making the decision to live for Christ. And your prescription is to repent and to be baptized into his name for the forgiveness of sins. And if you are a child of God, you've let circumstances dictate your behavior. You need to choose now to serve God no matter the environment, because it won't be an excuse on that day of judgment. You need to repent and place your trust in God. And whatever your request might be this morning, the waters of baptism or the prayers of the congregation on your behalf, come forward. Let it be known now while we stand and while we sing.